Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. We're back with our third installment of our RCV Explained series, taking a deep dive into ranked choice voting. As the policy gains more attention and more ballot measures and bills aim to either expand, limit, or ban RCV, we're here with everything you need to know: what RCV is, how it works, its track record, the arguments in favor and against, and where it's headed in 2024. Today, we're exploring the arguments against the adoption of ranked choice voting, and I'm joined by Trent England, Executive Director of Save Our States, a group dedicated to defending the Electoral College. He's also a chairman of StopRCV, a coalition of organizations, nonprofits, and activists who are advocating to stop the spread of the policy. Trent previously worked as a legal policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, and he's contributed to a variety of documentaries and publications. His most recent book, released in November, that he co-authored with Jason Sneed, is called The Case Against Ranked Choice Voting. Trent, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's great to be here.
I'm excited for our conversation. To start, let's start with the origin of StopRCV. What inspired its founding, and when was it started in the first place?
Yeah, so, I've been working on election policy issues going back over 20 years, a little bit at the federal level, but mostly at the state level, and wasn't really that aware of this whole debate around ranked choice voting. Of course, it just wasn't that big of an issue 20 years ago. I've done a lot of work defending the Electoral College, which I think is a really important safeguard in our electoral process, obviously for presidential elections. But I came across ranked choice voting and really initially was just sort of, open-minded about it, curious about this proposal, not really familiar with it. And as I dug into it, it just struck me that a lot of the concerns that I've had about elections for a long time, that we are allowing processes that aren't super transparent just because, some faction out there likes, a particular way of doing things, that we are allowing elections to drag out a lot longer than is necessary. All these things have been happening that I think diminish people's faith in elections, maybe not right away, but when something happens that shines a spotlight on the fact that, we don't have transparency, we don't have the kind of efficiency that gives us returns right away, that all of a sudden people are losing faith in our system. I just see ranked choice voting as something that makes that a lot worse. And so I've been working with a friend of mine named Jason Sneed. He runs the Honest Elections Project. I run Save Our States. We thought, let's create a coalition of organizations that are like-minded with us, that don't think that ranked choice voting is the right way to go. National groups, state groups, maybe some local groups, and let's really get the word out about the concerns that we have over ranked choice voting. We've been around for about a year, and we have a great coalition of groups from pretty much coast to coast. And yeah, I think our work is really making a difference in, just kind of raising some questions that need to be asked about this proposal.
And obviously the goal is to stop RCV, but what does the work that you are doing, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So we do a lot of work just educating people. We've written a little book about the argument that we have against ranked choice voting. We do a lot of op-eds and do a lot of interviews like this, just trying to get the word out to folks who are interested in elections. Obviously, that's an important constituency. And then just the broader public, particularly in places, I know we're going to talk about some of those places where ranked choice voting may be on the ballot, maybe in front of the legislature. So it's really an educational effort.
Got it. So you said StopRCV started a year ago. That corresponds to the 2022 special congressional election in Alaska, where we saw Democrat Mary Peltola defeat former Governor Sarah Palin and Republican Nick Begich. I feel like that's an election that really got the nation's attention when it comes to RCV. So how do those two things relate, RCV and this election, I guess?
Yeah, what happened in Alaska is interesting in all kinds of ways, because the backstory up there is that you had folks in politics who believed that they were going to lose elections unless they could change the rules. They believed that under the existing rules, kind of the normal election process, that they were going to lose. And so they looked around, they found ranked choice voting, and they determined that if they could get ranked choice voting in effect in Alaska, they would stand a much better chance of winning. Which right there, is, I think, again, it raises some interesting questions, right? If we have people changing the rules just for their own, sort of personal political advantage, that I think at least ought to, ought to leave us wondering whether it's the right direction to go. And they proposed something in Alaska called Final Four voting, which takes this system of ranked choice voting and couples it with what's called a jungle primary. A lot of people are familiar with closed or open primaries. Closed primary, if you are a Libertarian Party member, you can vote for the Libertarian Party candidates. But if you're not, if you're a Republican or a Democrat or not affiliated with any party, you don't get to help choose who the Libertarian nominee is. That's a closed primary. In open primaries, anybody who wants to have a say in the Libertarian Party nominee for an office, if they're not going to vote for a Republican nominee, not going to vote for a Democrat nominee, they can vote for the Libertarian nominee. You can't vote in every one, right? But you can pick your primary in an open primary. Jungle primary is totally different. And in a jungle primary, you just have everybody who's interested in running for that office on a ballot. So in Alaska, in that race, it was over 50, I think it was 51 or 53 or something. Anybody who can pay the filing fee and file the paperwork is on that ballot. And then everybody goes, they vote for one of those candidates. And then in a top four system like Alaska has, the four candidates who get the most votes go to the general election. And that's where ranked choice voting then is used in the general election to elect among those four. So in Alaska, right, you have this jungle primary. They pushed ranked choice voting with the jungle primary, with some other campaign finance measures. They bundle all this up and package this big election reform effort in Alaska, leaving a lot of voters, I think, unaware of the ranked choice voting part of the ballot measure. But it did pass, squeak through. They got that and used it in 2022 in the special election, the regular election. And what happened is, Alaska, a Republican-leaning state, you wound up initially with 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats among the top 4. And the Democrats got one of their candidates to drop out, leaving, as you mentioned, 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. And the Republicans, as often happens in this kind of an election scenario, right? You have 2 Republicans, you have 1 Democrat. It's a Republican-leaning state. So the Republicans wind up campaigning more against each other than against the Democrat, who's expected to lose. But what that means is with ranked choice voting, a lot of those Republican voters voted for only 1 Republican and then nobody else. Or in some cases, they even voted for 1 Republican and then gave their second vote to the Democrat. So when the ranked choice voting process is applied, the Democrat wins, even though he or she had fewer votes in the initial round of counting. So I think for all those reasons, I mean, partly it was just a surprise. A Democrat won Alaska. That's unusual, to say the least. But then when people look in, I think, to what happened, they realize this whole ranked choice voting system, it's not quite as, the folks pushing it claim it's just this simple way to guarantee a majority winner. Nobody can game the system. And then you look at something like Alaska and you go, wait a second, like it's a sort of game from the get-go, right? I mean, the people who pushed the system did it because they wanted to manipulate the outcome. So yeah, it's a really interesting case study of some of the downsides, or at least some of the way that ranked choice voting is oversold.
So your argument is that the way it's sold is not necessarily how it always plays out. Are there any other examples of this across the nation? I know RCV has been adopted in several localities. One example off the top of my head is like a school board election recently in California, correct? That's right. I mean, that is the best example of the downsides of ranked choice voting. As you say, it's oftentimes pushed in local elections. Those are nonpartisan elections, right? Oftentimes, local governments are looking for a way to try to save some money. And so ranked choice voting looks like that, right? We're going to have this. We're going to have a single election. We don't need to have a runoff or any kind of primaries or anything. And so instead of having 2 election days, we have 1 election day. And it's, these are often nonpartisan. Local elections are just inherently smaller, most of the time at least. So yeah, we've seen this adopted various places, including some counties in California. And so Alameda County, California, where the city of Oakland is, has ranked choice voting, used it in their local elections in the last cycle. That includes the Oakland school board elections. And, again, these aren't big elections, right? And in this case, there were only 3 candidates. So you have a pretty simple, not that many voters. It's a school board seat. You've got 3 candidates. Was hotly contested, though, right? All of these candidates were in the running to win.
And what happened is ranked choice voting creates new ways for voters to make mistakes. And people who don't work on elections oftentimes just don't realize the way that people make mistakes with ballots. There's just a lot of crazy things that happen when voters go to vote. And most of the people like us who think about these things, like we're political junkies, we're careful with our ballots and we know who we're going to vote for going in, right? And, a lot of people just aren't like that, right? And so what happened in Oakland, you had a bunch of voters a couple hundred voters who did not rank a candidate in first place, but they did rank candidates. Maybe they ranked somebody second and third. Maybe they just ranked somebody third. Maybe they just ranked somebody second, whatever. But they didn't rank somebody in first place. They had gaps in their rankings. Now, again, that doesn't happen without ranked choice voting, right? Like ranked choice voting makes this problem possible. And there's no obvious solution, right? Normal election is just a simple addition problem. You're adding one vote plus one vote plus one vote. Ranked choice voting is so much more complicated than that it raises these questions. There's no obvious answer. And so the software that Alameda County used had a bunch of different ways you could deal with this. One of those was to just ignore those ballots in the first round. There's no first round ranking. You ignore them in the first round. But what the county rules said to do was that you would kind of slide all the rankings up. So if they rank somebody second but not first, then their second place just gets pushed up to be their first place. You don't leave any gaps in people's rankings on the ballots. The rules said to do that. The county software was left programmed to do this other thing, to just ignore those ballots. They thought that their election was done and dusted in December. They had no idea that they'd made this mistake. They'd certified all the winners. Ranked choice voting is not transparent, right? So you think about it, you had all these people, candidates, lawyers, election officials, all these people involved. Nobody realized that they'd made this mistake until some researchers working for actually a group that's pro-ranked choice voting, Fair Vote, had these researchers doing some analysis of RCV elections, and they ran these numbers and said, wait a second, like something's wrong here, right? The numbers that the county got don't match up when we rerun the data. They let the county know on the Friday before Christmas weekend. So this is almost 2 months after the election. The county has to rerun all of their ranked choice voting results because in every race, you've got some people who are making this, whether it's a mistake, whether they're just trying to communicate that nobody's my first choice, like I don't like any of the candidates that much. I don't know. But thankfully, there was only one race where it changed the outcome. But in this one school board race, it completely flipped the outcome. It changed who got eliminated in the first round, which changed who won in the second round. And again, this is just, we've seen ranked choice voting elections that go to like 12 rounds of counting, right? This is just a two-step process because there's only 3 candidates. And yet they certified the wrong winner. The wrong winner winds up serving on the school board for a few weeks before he finally realizes, no, I really didn't win. He resigns, but still it takes a court order. 4 months later, they finally seat the right person on that school board. I mean, it highlights ranked choice voting makes voting harder for voters. It makes tabulating the votes harder for election officials. And it just makes the whole process harder to trust because you don't have the transparency that you have in a normal election process.
It's very interesting. With these election outcomes, have you seen a rise in either like measures to repeal RCV or limit it in some way, I guess, or change the rules?
No, that's we've certainly seen a lot of that, and that's actually the history of ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting came out of the Victorian era in London, right? This is actually a really old idea that most people have never heard of because it was tried and it was repealed, right? There were actually a lot of American cities that tried this in the first half of the 20th century. Every single one repealed it, right? So it's funny that we're going back through this process again where, Utah adopted a pilot program for ranked choice voting. The last count I saw, there had been 24 cities. I think there had been 23 cities that had adopted it, and 12 had repealed it. I know it's like about half of the cities there have already repealed it. Pierce County, Washington, where I grew up in Washington State, used it in one election, then got rid of it. Aspen, Colorado, used it in one election, then got rid of it. we're talking about Alaska. Alaska has a repeal campaign going on up there that's very active. So, yeah, I mean, the history with ranked choice voting is that a lot of people who try it don't like it and elect to get rid of it right away. Arlington County in Virginia, another place I used to live, actually, they tried it in a primary election out there and seemed to be really positive about it until, the Washington Post wrote a couple stories asking election officials to explain it. People had a hard time explaining how the process worked. And when they ran it, there was enough frustration that the county board real quickly came back and said, we're not going to go forward with using this anymore. So yeah, it's, it seems to fail the test, at least many times when it's tried.
So on your website, you have a few objections, and you've kind of touched on these already, listed against RCV. I figured it'd be helpful for our listeners to kind of go through them one by one and break them down. So first, how do you see RCV as being more complicated for voters?
Yeah, so on a ranked choice voting ballot, the simplest fact is it just takes more real estate on the ballot. Instead of indicating one preference for one candidate, you have to come up with some way to indicate multiple preferences for multiple candidates. This gets a little complicated because there are different versions of ranked choice voting. In Minneapolis, you can rank 3. No matter how many candidates there are, you can rank 3. You have these other top 4 systems or top 5 systems. And then you have places like New York City where, you can rank as many candidates as are on the ballot there, right? So that gets really complicated and can take a ton of space. And there also you have voters potentially writing numbers next to candidates rather than just filling in a bubble. That creates some problems. Or you have this big grid of bubbles, which again, it's like this big multiple choice test, right? Like all of a sudden you've got, A, B, C, D, E, F right across the top, sort of, first place, second place, et cetera. It is much more complicated for voters. And the folks who push ranked choice voting admit this, because as soon as they get it in a jurisdiction, they're instantly demanding, we need to spend a whole bunch of money on voter education. In New York City, it was $15 million needed to be spent on voter education to try to help voters understand the system. So even the folks pushing it will acknowledge, this is more complicated for voters.
Second objection, you kind of touched on this in the Alameda County example, but RCV making election administrators have more tasks to do, more of a burden on them, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that starts with in-person voting, right? If you're voting at the polls, there's some research that indicates every ranked choice voting election on a ballot takes a voter about 1 minute on average longer to complete. So you got longer lines at the polls. You got more work for poll workers explaining to voters how to use the ballot, replacing spoiled ballots. You have all of that. And then you have this election process that is almost impossible to hand verify. It's different. I mean, the Alameda County example shows, right? You've got this different kind of software. It's doing different kinds of things, right? You have to be able to have it programmed and figure out some way to really verify that it works, including in these cases that people don't automatically think about. They sort of think about the normal voter doing the normal thing, right? Not voters making various kinds of mistakes or, maybe protest votes or what have you. So, yeah, I mean, all that is more difficult. And then what happened in Arlington County, I mean, you just had election officials there who were sort of admitting that they really couldn't explain very well how the process worked. They used a more complicated version of ranked choice voting in Arlington County. They were choosing 2 candidates at the same time, which is really Fair Vote wants that kind of ranked choice voting, which is interesting. They want the most complicated version of it. They see that as the kind of the highest and best. But that really is what sunk it in Virginia, because, as I say, I mean, even the Washington Post, kind of folks who would, I think, tend to be on the side of pushing ranked choice voting, at the end of the day, couldn't defend it because they couldn't explain it.
You also touched on this earlier, but transparency, it's essential in our elections. And how do you think RCV makes our elections less transparent?
Yeah, this is my personal concern about ranked choice voting. We already see, I deal with voters all the time, talking about election integrity in various ways, right? A democratic system doesn't just have to be trustworthy. It has to be trusted, right? It doesn't just have to be honest. People have to believe that it's honest, right? And this is a higher burden that sometimes even election officials don't really understand and embrace, right? They can be completely honest, totally upright, doing everything to the best of their abilities. But if they can't prove it to ordinary voters, that's not success in elections. And the problem for me with ranked choice voting is you get a lot of advocates who I acknowledge, right? Well-meaning people, oftentimes really, really smart people, but in a sense, they're too smart for their own good, right? Because they look at this and they say, well, surely everyone can understand the way this algorithm works, right? Everybody can understand, and everybody's going to believe that the computer is going to do everything correctly, right? And, in a way, I love those folks, right? Because like I say, they are well-meaning and they oftentimes have a lot of great ideas. They certainly are very smart people, but they just don't understand what it takes to make a democratic system truly democratic, which is you have to have the trust, the faith of the people who are using that system. And, I tell people, you've got to apply the BS test, which stands for bus station, right? If you can't go down to the bus station and explain your reform to, a group of people there and have them explain it back to you in a way that makes sense, right? If it's too complicated for that interaction at the bus station, it fails the BS test, right? And I think ranked choice voting is kind of exhibit A for something that just doesn't meet that standard.
I like that test. I think that standard needs to be applied to more of our policies. Final objection, accountability. From your perspective, how does the policy make accountability more difficult in our elections?
Yeah, this was always my concern. I lived in Washington State as that state was transitioning to voting by mail. And one of the things that I experienced there, again, you have a lot of election officials. They're honest folks. They're hardworking. They want to do the job as well as they can. And all of a sudden, you're taking someone who's been running an election office. In some of these counties, right? They may have been running the election office there for 20 years. And they've got a key and there's another key and there's a video camera they've installed that, all these things work together so that they can prove that everything's being done in a way that's honest and there's nobody stuffing the ballot box, all these things. And then all of a sudden the state legislature comes along and says, but we want you to give all the ballots to the post office and you're not going to see them for 3 weeks. And then the post office is hopefully going to bring them back to you. And then we want you to treat them like they are worth $1 billion, right? We want them in a secure room with video surveillance and all this stuff, right? And the election officials just naturally say, well, why would I take my job that seriously if, why be the strongest link in a weak chain? And I think that's the issue with ranked choice voting is that it forces so much of this into a computerized tabulation system that election officials can't really prove is accurate. It's another thing that's going to degrade that accountability, right? That's going to reduce election officials to basically saying, look, we've got to trust the software. We got to trust the hardware. I can't prove it to you. And it just sort of, you either trust the system or you don't versus the kind of old, Reaganite trust but verify. I want to get our elections back to where people really feel like they can see it, they can understand it, they can explain it to their kids, and we can have a democratic process again.
Now, looking at some of RCV's arguments, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to, one of them, I think the strongest one. Choice, ranked choice voting. It's in the title of the policy. The argument is it gives voters more choices. And I feel like most Americans are frustrated by the binary choices that they're faced with at the ballot box. So how would you respond to that perspective?
Yeah, it's a really good, as you say, it's a very apt criticism of where we are with our politics today, right? People are frustrated with the choices that we have, and people feel like, we wind up with these candidates who, in some cases, nobody really likes, or maybe nobody really knows, right? In some of these local elections, I think that the challenge is we've gotten here partly by the previous round of reforms that were supposed to be about increasing voter choice and decreasing special interest power. And I think that's the cautionary tale that I hope people think about when they hear that argument, right? A lot of these same reformers, or, the earlier generation of similar reformers, were the folks who said, well, we want to have, we don't want to have nominating conventions. We want to have primaries. We don't want to have closed primaries. We want to have open primaries. And what I think is ironic to folks, at least who aren't maybe kind of steeped in a certain kind of political theory, right, is that as we've democratized these processes, people have grown less and less happy about the results, right? As we've democratized these processes, people have grown more upset about the amount of power that special interests seem to have. I think ranked choice voting is another one of these reforms where it creates the appearance of choice. But particularly when you further break down the partisan role in the process with something like a jungle primary, that actually creates more room for special interests outside of the political parties to have even more control over who those choices are. People forget that political parties, a strong political party is very democratic, right? Like, people can choose to participate. You choose to go to your precinct meeting, to go to your county convention. You have a voice there. And you might have somebody who lives in your town who's worth $1 billion. But if they want to participate in that process, ultimately, they either have to convince the people who show up at the precinct caucus and the county convention, they have to go there themselves, or they can spend a bunch of money trying to convince those people. But it's not as effective convincing people who are engaged and informed as it is trying to convince people who are making up their mind on election day who they're going to vote for in a primary. And so, I think ranked choice voting is like this. It's supported by a lot of outside money, people who don't like the party process, but they don't like the party process because they want themselves and their friends, in my opinion at least, to have more power in the process, right? And so I think ranked choice voting just doesn't really deliver. It creates the appearance of having more choices, but at the end of the day, it tends to just empower the same kind of interests that people are actually pretty frustrated with.
Returning to RCV in action, did anything stick out to you in this past November's elections in relation to RCV?
We saw some RCV repeal efforts going. Well, we saw particularly there was a town in Minnesota that was trying to repeal ranked choice voting. That did not happen. We saw a couple towns in Michigan that passed a sort of like, we would do ranked choice voting if we were allowed to. So you see folks out there continuing to push it. I mean, there is a massive amount of money behind these efforts to get ranked choice voting, which is interesting to me. I mean, again, it tends to come from folks who are, in my estimation, kind of on the center left in politics. They don't like the right. They also don't like the far left in many cases. And they, again, this is just my interpretation, but I think that they see that they would have a lot more say in politics in a ranked choice voting situation rather than where they have to work through political parties. And they've spent just lavishly in some of these races. So I think that's what we've seen. The folks who are working on these repeals, and I'm not directly involved in that, but it's a steep hill to climb, because there is, if this winds up on the ballot in Alaska, I think that the folks who are trying to repeal ranked choice voting will probably be outspent, 5-1, 10-1. On the other hand, this went to the ballot in Massachusetts.
Yep.
Yeah, a few years ago. And the folks pushing it spent, I don't remember what they spent, but I believe it was over $1 million. The folks on the other side spent $16,000 and won. So money doesn't always determine the outcome, thankfully.
Yeah, very true. I cover ballot measures, so I covered that race. Yep.
Yeah.
Your book, The Case Against Ranked Choice Voting, just came out in November. Give a quick plug to our listeners. What can they expect if they pick up the book?
Yeah, this is one of Encounter Books' broadsides, which means it's sort of a short, very openly opinionated book. I think we're about 45 pages long. So it's an easy read, and it just runs through what is ranked choice voting, who's behind it, and what's wrong with it. Again, very, very concisely. And it was fun to write. Hopefully it'll be fun to read.
Great. And then you, like you mentioned, are in charge of Save Our States, which is related to defending the Electoral College. Do you see any overlap in your work with Save Our States and StopRCV?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because there is fascinating overlap between these two things, because Maine has adopted ranked choice voting. They were the earliest state to do it at the state level. And of course, Alaska now has as well. And one of the debates, particularly that they've had in Maine, is, they want to use ranked choice voting to choose their presidential electors. Well, that's fine. I mean, you could do that within a state, whether I think that's a good idea or not. Like, it works, right? Ranked choice voting can work to do that. But they had a lot of folks really invested in getting ranked choice voting in Maine. That was it was a huge political fight that went on up there for years. They finally got it. Then the national popular vote folks show up, and they've been lobbying to get that passed up there. The Maine legislature has not adopted it thus far. You can't take ranked choice voting results and aggregate them with other states. And when I say that, sometimes people say, well, what do you mean? Like, of course you can. They're numbers and you can add up numbers. Like that's true, right? But it's the same idea. You can't add percentages, right? Like you can add percentages, but the result that you get is meaningless. It's not mathematics. It's nothing, right? And that's the problem with ranked choice voting. I had always assumed that what they would do in Maine is say, well, fine, if the National Popular Vote Compact ever takes effect and states are aggregating all of their popular votes across state lines, that Maine would they would just report the first preference numbers, right? They just report the numbers that are the most analogous to a normal election result. They actually have gone the other way. The folks up there said, no, we spent all this effort to get ranked choice voting. We're going to force other states to use our ranked choice voting adjusted results, which again, it's not math. If it's not math, it's not democracy, right? It's just politics. This to me is a strange, unforced error that the reformers have made. And again, very smart people who know better, but for political reasons have kind of taken this line. Ranked choice voting, it turns out, creates a major problem for the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. That debate is just continuing to play out. I think it's a big part of why Maine has not passed the National Popular Vote Compact up there, because I think there are enough folks up there who kind of understand, like, we've got to reconcile these things before we do that.
Yeah, it's certainly a complicated situation.
Yeah.
Finally, with November's elections behind us, we're headed into 2024. What is on the agenda for StopRCV heading into the new year?
Yeah, we are going to see a lot of ballot measures for ranked choice voting. Now, whether they qualify for the ballot is always an open question. You cover these things. We saw a ranked choice voting measure in Missouri where the folks pushing it spent $7 million to try to get it on the ballot and didn't, because they didn't get the signatures from the right geographic areas within the state. But the folks are, they're back. Same folks are back and saying that they're going to spend, I think they, kind of collectively pledged to spend like $22 million up there next time, right? So they're not going away. We know that it's going to be on the ballot in Nevada because they have a constitutional amendment process where it's passed once, it would have to pass again, then they would have final five voting. So a jungle primary with a final five ranked choice voting general, that'll be on the ballot there in 24. Hopefully repeal will be on the ballot in Alaska. And then, other states where it is likely to be on the ballot, Oregon, I think we have a legislative referred ballot measure there. I know there's talk in Ohio, Idaho, Arizona. There's probably a few more out there. I know it's being talked about in a few other states. I don't think it's been filed in others thus far, but it would not be surprising if this was on the ballot in about 10 states in 2024, which is a big deal. But again, it's interesting to me that there are a lot of folks who I think especially if we have a rematch between Trump and Biden, I think this has become an outlet for some of the frustration that people have, that, maybe if we just adopt this other election process, then we would get different candidates or more choices or something. And I understand that, I understand that reaction, even if I think it's just doesn't quite understand the real nature of the problem.
Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Thank you for your time today, your expertise. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much.
And for our listeners, we'll be back in your feed on Thursday with the final episode of our RCV Explained series. I'll be interviewing Jack Santucci from Queens College, City University of New York, to dive deeper into the history and future of RCV. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.